Grace Morrison folded the last of Sophie's summer dresses into the small suitcase, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. 28 years old and working as a nanny for one of Silicon Valley's most successful families had never been part of her original plan. Yet here she stood in the staff quarters of the Westfield mansion, preparing for something she had never imagined. The morning sunlight filtered through her modest bedroom window as Grace reflected on the past 18 months. She had taken this position after her teaching credential program fell through due to family financial troubles. Her mother's medical bills had consumed every penny of her savings, and working as a live-in nanny provided both income and stability. What she hadn't expected was how deeply she would grow to love the bright-eyed little girl who had lost her mother far too young. Cameron Westfield was a mystery wrapped in expensive suits and board meetings. Grace had studied his rare interviews online, watched him speak at technology conferences with brilliant confidence, yet in person, he remained distant. Their interactions consisted of brief morning greetings and occasional scheduling discussions. He was handsome in that effortless way some men possessed, with hazel eyes that seemed to calculate complex algorithms even during casual conversations. But those eyes rarely landed on Grace for more than a fleeting second. The announcement 3 days earlier. Cameron had called Grace into his home office. The room smelled of leather and old books, a sanctuary of dark wood and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the San Francisco Bay. He had stood by those windows, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense. Grace had waited, her heart beating faster than usual. Private meetings with her employer were rare, almost non-existent. "I'm taking Sophie on vacation," Cameron had said without preamble. 10 days in the Caribbean. "We leave Friday," Grace had nodded, already calculating which activities would keep Sophie entertained during the break. Perhaps she could take the little girl to the local children's museum or plan some art projects. "You'll be joining us." The words had hung in the air between them. Grace remembered how her breath had caught, how she had struggled to find an appropriate response. "Victoria and I need time together," Cameron had continued, referring to his girlfriend of 5 months. "But Sophie needs supervision and routine. You'll have your own accommodations, of course." Separate from the main villa, Grace had accepted because refusing wasn't really an option. This was her job. But as she had left his office, she had caught a glimpse of something in Cameron's expression. Something that looked almost like regret. Arrival in paradise the private jet had been. Grace's first experience with true luxury. She had tried not to stare at the cream leather seats, the polished mahogany tables, or the flight attendant who offered fresh fruit and sparkling water with genuine warmth. Sophie had bounced in her seat, pressing her face against the window, narrating every cloud formation they passed. Victoria Sterling sat in the forward cabin with Cameron, her designer sunglasses perched perfectly on her head, her linen pantsuit unwrinkled despite hours of travel. She was beautiful in that calculated way magazine editors loved, all sharp cheekbones and practiced poise. Grace had overheard her on the phone earlier, complaining about having to vacation with the help and the child. The island emerged below them like something from a travel magazine. Crystal blue water met white sand beaches. Palm trees swayed in gentle breezes. The resort sprawled across a private cove, with individual villas dotting the landscape like scattered jewels. Grace's cottage sat 50 yards from the main villa, connected by a stone pathway lined with hibiscus flowers. It was small but stunning, with whitewashed walls, blue shutters, and a tiny porch overlooking a garden filled with birds of paradise. Sophie's adjoining room featured a canopy bed draped with mosquito netting that made the little girl squeal with delight. "This is like a fairy tale," Sophie had exclaimed, spinning in circles. "Grace, can we go to the beach right now, please?" The beach encounter Grace had changed into her swimsuit, with trembling hands. The coral-colored two-piece had seemed modest in the store, but now she felt exposed. She wasn't used to showing this much skin. Her work uniform consisted of comfortable jeans and simple shirts, clothing that allowed her to chase after an energetic 7-year-old without worry. The beach was breathtaking. Soft sand, gentle waves, and warm sunshine that felt like a blessing against her pale skin. Sophie immediately began constructing an elaborate sand castle, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked. Grace spread their towels beneath a palm tree and settled in with a book, letting the sound of the ocean wash over her. For the first time in months, she felt herself relax. "Excuse me, but I have to ask." A male voice interrupted her thoughts. "Are you a model?" Grace looked up to find two men in their early 30s, both tanned and confident, smiling down at her. The speaker was tall, with sun-bleached hair and an easy grin. "No, I'm a nanny," Grace replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Well, someone is very lucky to have you," the second man said. "I'm Tyler, and this is Brandon. We're staying at the resort for a wedding. Would you like to join us for drinks later?" Before Grace could formulate a polite refusal, she felt it. A gaze so intense it was almost physical. She turned her head and found Cameron standing near the water's edge, perhaps 60 feet away. Victoria stood beside him, gesturing towards something in the distance, but Cameron wasn't looking. He was staring directly at Grace. An unexpected reaction. The expression on Cameron's face made Grace's breath stop. His hazel eyes had darkened to something nearly green, intense and focused entirely on her. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides. He looked like a man barely containing some powerful emotion, though Grace couldn't identify what it might be. Then abruptly, Cameron turned and walked away. Not toward Grace, but in the opposite direction. Leaving Victoria standing alone on the beach with her mouth open in surprise, Grace watched him disappear into the palm trees, her heart pounding inexplicably. "So, about those drinks?" Tyler prompted. "Thank you, but no," Grace managed. "I'm working." The men eventually wandered off, but Grace couldn't shake the image of Cameron's face. In 18 months of employment, he had never looked at her like that. Had never really looked at her at all. What had changed? And more importantly, what did it mean? Sophie ran up, covered in sand and grinning. "Grace, come see what I built. It has towers and everything." Grace followed the little girl to admire the castle, but her mind remained on that moment on the beach. On the intensity in Cameron's eyes, on the way he had clenched his fists as if fighting something inside himself. That evening, a note appeared under her door. Dinner at 7 in the main restaurant? All 4 of them. Cameron's handwriting was bold and decisive, each letter perfectly formed. Grace stared at the note, wondering what the evening would bring, completely unaware that everything was about to change. Grace chose her only formal dress, a simple emerald wrap style that she had owned for years. The fabric was soft and comfortable, nothing like the designer pieces Victoria wore, but it was appropriate and modest. She brushed her dark hair until it fell in natural waves around her shoulders and applied minimal makeup before collecting Sophie from the adjoining room. The restaurant was elegant beyond anything Grace had experienced. White tablecloths stretched across candlelit tables. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the space. A pianist played soft jazz in the corner. Grace felt acutely aware of her second hand. Dress in practical sandals as they approached the table where Cameron and Victoria waited. Cameron stood immediately, pulling out chairs for both Grace and Sophie. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and Grace saw that same intensity from the beach. Though more controlled now. "You look beautiful," Cameron said quietly, his voice just loud enough for Grace to hear. Grace froze, certain she had misheard. But Victoria's sharp intake of breath and narrowed eyes confirmed the words had been real. "Thank you, Mr. Westfield," Grace managed, her voice barely steady. Victoria's smile was cold and practiced. "How thoughtful of you to bring something suitable to wear. I wasn't certain the staff would pack appropriately." Sophie frowned, swinging her legs under the table. "Grace always looks pretty. She's the prettiest person I know, besides Mommy." The mention of Jessica, Cameron's late wife, created a moment of heavy silence. Victoria's expression tightened. Cameron's hand gripped his water glass until his knuckles went white. "Sophie, we don't talk about that at dinner," Victoria said sharply. "About Mommy?" Sophie's voice rose with confusion. "But Daddy says I should always remember her and talk about her whenever I want." Cameron's jaw clenched. "That's correct, Sophie. You can talk about your mother anytime you choose." Victoria took a long sip of wine, her movements deliberate. "Of course. I simply meant that perhaps more cheerful topics would be appropriate for a vacation dinner." The meal proceeded with painful awkwardness. Victoria dominated conversation, discussing fashion trends and social events in New York that meant nothing to Grace. Sophie grew restless, pushing food around her plate and fidgeting in her seat. "Sophie, sit properly," Victoria commanded. "You're behaving like an undisciplined child." "She is a child," Cameron said coldly. "She's 7 years old. 7-year-olds should have better manners in public settings." Grace gently touched Sophie's hand under the table, offering silent comfort. The little girl looked close to tears, her lower lip trembling. "Perhaps we could order dessert," Grace suggested softly. The chocolate cake looked wonderful, and Sophie has been very patient. Victoria set down her fork with deliberate precision. "Of course you would suggest sweets. I suppose you let her have whatever she wants at home as well." "I let her be happy," Grace replied before she could stop herself. "And healthy. And loved." The silence that followed felt dangerous. Victoria's face flushed with anger. Cameron slowly placed his napkin on the table, his movements controlled, but his eyes blazing. "Grace is an exceptional nanny," Cameron said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "Sophie is thriving under her care. I won't tolerate anyone suggesting otherwise." Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. She reached for her wineglass with a shaking hand. "I was merely making an observation about structure and discipline. Your observation is neither wanted nor appreciated." The rest of dinner passed in tense silence. When the meal finally ended, Grace quickly excused herself and Sophie, grateful to escape the suffocating atmosphere. As they walked back to their cottage, under strings of twinkling lights, Sophie slipped her small hand into Grace's. "Daddy doesn't love Victoria," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "Not like he loved Mommy." Grace had no response to that observation. No, she simply squeezed Sophie's hand and led her home. A midnight crisis. Grace had just fallen asleep when frantic knocking jolted her awake. She grabbed her robe and rushed to the door, finding Cameron standing there in pajama pants and an unbuttoned shirt, his hair disheveled and panic clear in his eyes. "Sophie?" he said breathlessly. "I can't find Sophie. She's not in her room. I went to check on her and she was gone." Grace's heart dropped. She rushed to Sophie's adjoining room, finding the bed empty and the porch door standing open. Without thinking, she grabbed Cameron's arm. The beach. She mentioned earlier that she wanted to see the ocean at night when the stars reflect on the water. They ran together down the stone pathway, Grace's bare feet slapping against the cool stones. The beach stretched before them, silvery in the moonlight, and there, sitting at the water's edge, was Sophie in her pajamas, staring at the sky. "Sophie." Cameron's voice cracked with relief and fear. He scooped his daughter into his arms, holding her so tightly Grace could see his shoulders shaking. "You can't leave like that. You scared me so badly." "I'm sorry, Daddy," Sophie whispered. "I just wanted to see the stars on the water like Mommy used to show me." Cameron sank onto the sand, still holding Sophie, and for the first time since Grace had known him, she saw tears on his face. "Your mother loved the stars," he said softly. "She would take you out at night and tell you stories about constellations." "I remember," Sophie said. She said each star was someone's wish coming true. Grace stood a few feet away, feeling like an intruder on this intimate moment. But Cameron looked up at her, his eyes bright with tears, and gestured for her to sit. "Stay," he said simply. "Please." Grace lowered herself onto the sand, maintaining a respectful distance. The ocean whispered against the shore. Stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. "I've been a terrible father," Cameron said quietly, still holding Sophie. "I buried myself in work after Jessica died. I thought providing financial security was enough. But Sophie needed more than money. She needed presence. She needed love." "You're not terrible, Daddy," Sophie protested. "You're just sad sometimes." "I am sad," Cameron admitted. "But that's not an excuse for not being there for you. For not seeing what was right in front of me." His eyes found Grace's in the moonlight, and the intensity there made her breath catch. "Grace has given you what I couldn't," he continued. "She's been present, patient, loving. She's been the mother figure you needed. I never even properly thanked her." "You don't need to thank me," Grace said softly. Sophie is wonderful. Caring for her has never felt like work." "Why?" Cameron asked. "Why do you care so much?" "She's not your daughter. This is just a job." Grace looked at Sophie's sleepy face, resting against Cameron's chest, and she felt her own eyes sting with tears. "Because she deserves to be loved," Grace said simply. "Every child deserves that. And Sophie is special. She's bright and kind and sees the world with such hope despite losing her mother so young. How could I not love her?" Cameron stared at Grace for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. "I don't know how I never saw it before. It's a resort gala." The resort hosted a formal gala for guests. Victoria insisted they attend, viewing it as an opportunity to network with other wealthy vacationers. Grace had planned to stay at the cottage with Sophie, but the little girl was invited to a supervised children's event with activities and movies. "You should come to the gala," Cameron said that afternoon. Finding Grace on the cottage porch where she was reading, as part of the family. "I don't think that's appropriate, Mr. Westfield." "Cameron," he corrected, "and it's completely appropriate. You're here with us. You should enjoy the resort amenities." Victoria appeared behind him, her expression cold. "Darling, I'm certain Grace would be more comfortable in her cottage. She's not really dressed for formal events." "Then we'll arrange for something appropriate," Cameron said firmly. "The resort boutique can provide a dress." An hour later, Grace found herself in a boutique filled with expensive gowns. The attendant, a kind woman named Rosa, selected several options. Grace tried on a navy dress with delicate beading that caught the light like captured starlight. It fit perfectly, elegant, without being ostentatious. "You look like a princess," Sophie declared when Grace emerged at the gala. Grace felt out of place among the wealthy guests. Crystal champagne flutes, designer gowns, conversations about summer homes and yacht clubs, but Cameron stayed close, introducing her as Sophie's nanny with a respect that made Victoria's jaw tighten. "You're quite young to be a nanny," one woman said to Grace. "Don't you have other ambitions?" Before Grace could respond, Cameron spoke. "Grace is incredibly educated. She was pursuing her teaching credential before family circumstances required a change in plans. She's one of the most capable and intelligent people I know." Grace stared at him in shock. How did he know about her teaching program? She had never mentioned it. Victoria's hand tightened on Cameron's arm. "Darling, let's dance." "They're playing our song." Cameron gently removed her hand. "I don't think we have a song, Victoria." The evening deteriorated from there. Victoria drank too much champagne and began making cutting remarks about everything from the food quality to the other guests' fashion choices. When a kind older gentleman asked Grace about her background and interests, Victoria interrupted loudly. "She's the help. I'm certain she'd rather not be interrogated at a social event." The words hung in the air. Several nearby guests looked uncomfortable. Grace felt humiliation wash over her, but before she could excuse herself, Cameron's voice cut through the tension like ice. "Grace is here as my guest. She will be treated with respect. If you cannot manage that, Victoria, perhaps you should retire for the evening." Victoria's face went white, then red. "How dare you speak to me that way? In front of all these people? How dare you treat someone with such contempt simply because they work for a living?" Victoria grabbed her clutch and stormed out, leaving Cameron standing amid curious onlookers. He turned to Grace, his expression soft, despite the tension in his shoulders. "I apologize. You shouldn't have been subjected to that. You don't need to apologize for her," Grace said quietly. "Because I've allowed it for months. I've watched her treat you and the staff poorly, and I said nothing. That ends now." Cameron offered his hand. "Would you dance with me?" "I'd like at least one pleasant moment this evening." Grace hesitated, acutely aware of watching eyes, but something in Cameron's expression made her place her hand in his. They moved to the dance floor as a slow song began, and Cameron's hand settled at her waist with surprising gentleness. "You didn't have to defend me," Grace said softly as they swayed. "Yes, I did. You've been defending Sophie and caring for her when I was too lost in grief to see what she needed. The least I can do is ensure you're treated with the respect you deserve." They danced in silence for a moment, and Grace became aware of how close they were. How Cameron's hand felt warm against her back. How his eyes never left her face. "Grace," he said quietly, "can I ask you something? Of course, are you happy? Working for me, I mean, is it what you want?" Grace considered the question carefully. "Sophie makes me happy. Watching her grow and learn brings me joy. As for the rest, I'm content. Content isn't the same as happy." "No," Grace agreed, "but it's more than many people have." Cameron's expression grew troubled. "You deserve more than contentment. You deserve happiness. Dreams fulfilled. Someone who sees your worth." Before Grace could respond, the song ended. Cameron stepped back, though his hand lingered at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for the dance," he said formally. But his eyes told a different story. Grace returned to the cottage that night with her mind spinning, completely unaware that in the main villa, Cameron was ending his relationship with Victoria, and that tomorrow would bring revelations that would change everything. Grace woke to the sound of raised voices carrying across the garden from the main. She tried to ignore them, focusing on preparing breakfast for Sophie, but the argument grew louder and impossible to dismiss. "You're ending this because of her." Victoria's voice was shrill with anger. "The nanny. I can't believe you're throwing away what we have for someone who cares for your child for money." "What we have?" Cameron's voice was cold and controlled. "We have nothing, Victoria. We never did. I thought maybe I could move forward, find companionship, but I was fooling myself. This is humiliating. Do you have any idea how this will look? Cameron Westfield leaving his girlfriend for the help. I'm not leaving you for anyone. I'm leaving you because this relationship is wrong. It's been wrong from the start. I'm not in love with you. I never was. And you've made it clear you have no genuine affection for my daughter." Grace quickly closed the window, not wanting to hear more. Sophie emerged from her room, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Is Victoria yelling again?" the little girl asked. "Adults sometimes disagree," Grace said carefully. "Let's have breakfast on the porch, shall we?" They were finishing pancakes when Cameron appeared on the pathway. He looked exhausted, his hair uncombed and dark circles under his eyes, but there was something different about him. A lightness in his shoulders, relief in his expression. "Good morning," he said quietly. "Sophie, could you give me a moment to speak with Grace alone?" Sophie looked between them with knowing eyes far too old for 7. "Okay, Daddy. I'll go brush my teeth for a really, really long time." After Sophie disappeared inside, Cameron sat in the chair across from Grace. The morning sun caught golden highlights in his hair. His hazel eyes were clear and focused entirely on her. "Victoria and I have ended our relationship," he said without preamble. "She's leaving on the resort shuttle this afternoon." "I'm sorry," Grace said automatically, though she wasn't sure she meant it. "I'm not." Cameron leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Grace, I need to tell you something. I need to be honest, even though it might cost me the best nanny Sophie has ever had." Grace's heart began to race. "Mr. Westfield, I don't think Cameron—" "Please call me Cameron." He took a breath. "Yesterday on the beach, when I saw you with those men, something happened. Something I've been too blind and too buried in grief to recognize until that moment. You don't have to explain? Yes, I do. Because I've been unfair to you. For 18 months, you've been in my home, caring for my daughter. Being present and patient and loving, and I barely acknowledged your existence. I treated you like furniture. Like something that served a function, but didn't deserve real attention." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but said nothing. "Then I saw you on that beach," Cameron continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Actually saw you. Not as the nanny or the help, but as a woman. A beautiful, vibrant, incredible woman. And I felt something I thought died with Jessica. Something that terrified me so much I walked away." "What did you feel?" Grace whispered. "Jealousy, possessiveness, desire." Cameron's eyes held hers. "I wanted to walk over to those men and tell them you were with me, that they had no right to look at you that way. And then I realized how insane that was. You're my employee. You're not with me. You've never been with me." Grace's hands trembled in her lap. "Cameron, this isn't appropriate. I work for you. There's a power dynamic that makes this Wrong, complicated? Impossible? Cameron finished. Believe me, I've spent all night thinking about every reason this is a terrible idea. But I can't stop thinking about you. About how you laugh when Sophie tells jokes. About how you always smell like vanilla and sunshine. About how you put everyone else's needs before your own without complaint. You're grieving, Grace said softly. You lost your wife. You're lonely. This isn't real. Cameron shook his head firmly. I loved Jessica with everything I had. Her death nearly destroyed me. But it's been 3 years, Grace. 3 years of going through the motions. Of pretending I was living when I was really just existing. And then yesterday, I saw you, and I felt alive again. A walk on the beach, Grace stood abruptly, needing space to think. I need to process this. Sophie will be wondering. Sophie is fine. She's probably listening through the window, honestly. Cameron stood as well, maintaining a respectful distance. Take the morning. Think about what I've said. I'll watch Sophie. We'll build sandcastles and collect shells. You take time for yourself. Grace nodded gratefully and walked toward the beach. Her mind whirled with confusion and emotion. Cameron Westfield had just confessed feelings for her. The man who had barely spoken to her in 18 months had suddenly noticed her existence and claimed to want more. But what did that mean? What could it mean? She was his employee. The power imbalance made any relationship inherently problematic. If things went wrong, she would lose her job, her home, and worst of all, her daily presence in Sophie's life. The little girl she had come to love would be taken from her. Yet as Grace walked along the shoreline, letting waves wash over her feet, she couldn't deny her own feelings. She had noticed Cameron from the very beginning. How could she not? He was brilliant, handsome, and when he smiled at Sophie, his whole face transformed with love. Grace had carefully locked away any romantic thoughts, knowing they were inappropriate and impossible. But they had existed nonetheless, hidden in the quiet corners of her heart. You look troubled. An elderly woman sat on a bench near the water, her white hair pulled back in an elegant bun. Forgive an old lady's nosiness, but I've found that beautiful young women walking alone on beaches are usually wrestling with matters of the heart. Grace smiled despite herself and sat beside the woman. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's lived long enough to recognize the signs? I'm Dorothy. My husband and I have been coming to this resort for 30 years. He's napping in our villa, so I'm enjoying the morning air. Grace. Well, Grace, would you like to talk about it? Sometimes a stranger's perspective helps. Grace found herself telling Dorothy everything. About her job, about Cameron's confession, about her fears and confusion. The older woman listened without interruption, her kind eyes thoughtful. May I ask you something? Dorothy said when Grace finished. Do you have feelings for this man? I think so. But I've been so careful not to examine those feelings too closely. It seemed safer that way. Safe is often the enemy of happy, my dear. I understand your concerns about the power dynamic. They're valid. But consider this. He's been honest with you. He's ended his relationship with someone else before pursuing anything with you. He's giving you space to decide. Those are the actions of a good man. But what about Sophie? If things don't work out, I lose her. That might hurt more than anything. Dorothy patted Grace's hand gently. Love always involves risk. Whether it's romantic love, parental love, or friendship, the question isn't whether you might get hurt. The question is whether the possibility of happiness is worth the risk of pain. An honest conversation. Grace returned to the cottage hours later to find Cameron and Sophie building an elaborate sandcastle near the water. Sophie squealed with delight, running to show Grace the shells they had collected. Cameron stood back, watching with an uncertain expression. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Grace found Cameron sitting on the main villa's terrace, staring at the stars. Can we talk? She asked softly. Cameron stood immediately. Of course. Please sit. They settled into comfortable chairs with the sound of the ocean in the background. For a moment, neither spoke. I've been thinking about what you said, Grace began. About your feelings? About us. And Cameron's voice was carefully neutral, but Grace could see tension in his shoulders. "I'm terrified," Grace admitted, "of making the wrong choice, of losing Sophie if this goes badly, of the complications and the judgment from others. But I'm also terrified of walking away from something that might be wonderful simply because it's complicated." Cameron leaned forward. "I can't promise this will be easy. I can't promise people won't talk or judge. But I can promise honesty, respect, and the chance to see where this goes without pressure." "What does that mean practically?" "It means I'm not asking you to be my girlfriend tonight. I'm asking if I can take you on a date. A real date where we talk and get to know each other as people, rather than employer and employee. If it doesn't feel right, we go back to how things were with no consequences to your position." "Can we really go back?" Grace asked quietly. "I don't know," Cameron admitted. "But I promise Sophie's care and your job security won't depend on your romantic feelings toward me. That would be unconscionable." Grace looked at this man before her, vulnerable and honest in a way she had never seen. She thought about Sophie's words about her father, not smiling the way he used to. She thought about the feeling of dancing with Cameron at the gala. She thought about Dorothy's words about risk and happiness. "One date," Grace said finally. "Here, on the island away from real life, we see how it feels." Cameron's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "One date. Tomorrow night, I'll arrange everything." A perfect evening the next evening, Cameron took Grace to a small restaurant away from the resort. It was local, authentic, with colorful walls and live music. They sat at a corner table and talked for hours. Grace learned that Cameron had grown up poor, that his mother cleaned houses to put him through community college, that he had built his company from an idea sketched on napkins in a dingy apartment. He learned that Grace had been accepted to a prestigious teaching program, couldn't attend because her mother's cancer treatment depleted their savings, that she sent most of her salary home to help with ongoing medical bills, that she dreamed of someday opening a small school for underprivileged children. "You're extraordinary," Cameron said, his eyes warm. "The sacrifices you've made for your family, the love you give Sophie, the dreams you still hold despite setbacks. I'm just doing what needs to be done." That's what extraordinary people always say. After dinner, they walked along the beach under stars. Cameron took Grace's hand tentatively, and when she didn't pull away, his fingers intertwined with hers. "This feels right," he said quietly. "For the first time in 3 years, something feels completely right." Grace stopped walking and turned to face him. The moonlight cast silver highlights across his face, and she could see vulnerability and hope in his expression. "It does feel right," she agreed. "But I'm still scared. So am I terrified, actually." Cameron lifted his free hand to cup her cheek gently. "But I think the best things in life are a little scary." He leaned in slowly, giving Grace every opportunity to pull away. But she didn't. When his lips met hers, gentle and questioning, Grace felt something inside her chest unfold like a flower opening to sunlight. The kiss was soft, sweet, perfect. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. Coming home, the remaining days on the island passed like a dream. Cameron and Grace spent evenings together after Sophie went to sleep, talking and laughing and slowly building something real. During the days, they were careful around Sophie, not wanting to confuse the little girl until they were certain about their feelings. But on their last morning, as they packed to return to San Francisco, Sophie came running into Grace's cottage with Cameron following behind, looking sheepish. "Grace, Daddy says you might stay with us forever. Is that true? Please say yes." Grace looked at Cameron, who shrugged helplessly. She asked directly. "I've never been able to lie to her." Sophie grabbed Grace's hands. "I've been wishing on stars every night. I wished for Daddy to be happy again. I wished for you to stay. I wished for us to be a real family." Grace knelt down to Sophie's level, tears in her eyes. "Sweetheart, your daddy and I are still figuring things out, but no matter what happens between us, I'm not going anywhere. I'll always be in your life if you want me there."
Ow.
"I want you there forever," Sophie said firmly. "And Daddy does too. I can tell." Cameron moved closer, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. "She's right. I do want you there. Not just as Sophie's nanny, as part of our family. if you'll have us." Grace stood, looking at this man and child who had somehow become her whole world. The risks were still there. Complications remained. But Dorothy had been right. Possibility of happiness was absolutely worth the risk of pain. "Yes," Grace whispered. "I'll have you, both of you," Sophie cheered, and threw her arms around both of them. Cameron pulled Grace close, kissing her forehead as tears rolled down her cheeks. 3 months later, Grace moved out of the staff quarters and into the main house. 6 months after that, Cameron proposed on the same beach where he had first truly seen her. A year after their Caribbean vacation, they married in a small ceremony with Sophie as flower girl, proudly announcing that she finally had the family she had wished for. And every night the three of them would look at the stars together, remembering that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from taking chances on love, even when it's complicated, scary, and absolutely worth it.